Thanks, Anushila, for this invitation to give a talk to the TIFR Hyderabad Sawal Jawab series. Much like the TIFR Mumbai's Chai and Why series, the goal of this is, I presume, to reach out to the wider audience and to discuss scientific literature, but perhaps from the point of view of implications to broad society at large. So the talk that I'm going to give you today was titled "Your Brain on Stress." But perhaps another way of thinking about it is you could ask yourself whether you should be adapting or not adapting, and that is a central question. It's very hard to control stress. Stress is inevitable. It's your responses that remain within your control in a sense. So let's start by defining the term stress. This is actually a difficult term to define. You can't get too many people to agree on exactly what is clearly defined as stress. So I'm going to give you a broad definition, and you can see that many different things, you'll immediately see that stress is unique to you. What stresses you may not stress me out, and certainly may not stress the third person out. So stress can be defined as any condition, physical, psychological, social, etc., that disrupts the homeostatic balance of your body. And for this, I have to define what is homeostasis. So homeostasis is the ability of your body to function within a healthy physiological functioning range. Think about it like this. Your blood pressure has to stay within a healthy range. Your blood sugar has to stay within a healthy range. You go out of that, if you get dysregulated, you need to come back to that baseline healthy state. So in many ways, you can think about stress as something that will tip you out of this working healthy balance of your body. The goal then, of course, of the body is to immediately respond to this and bring it back to standard balance. And what are the kinds of stressors we can think about? Let's think about an acute physical stressor. Say somebody tells you, okay, I now need you to go out of the house, stop listening to this lecture and run 5 kilometers. That will be an actual acute physical stressor. But your body, hopefully, if it's well trained, will be able to manage to run 5 kilometers. If it's not so well trained, you'll run a few kilometers, stop, gas, run a few kilometers more. But you will adapt. You'll be able to handle it because our body is actually beautifully tuned to handling acute physical stressors. Then there's the chronic physical stress. Let's say you decide, oh, I ran the 5 kilometers. I loved it. It was so much fun. I want to run a marathon. So I'm going to run a half marathon first. That's a chronic physical stress because you will now have to train yourself consistently to be able to run 22 kilometers. You're not going to be able to say one day I'm going to just get up and run 22 kilometers straight away. That won't happen. You'll actually have to train for it. And that training is a chronic physical stress. But again, your body is beautifully adapted to handling such stressors. You will adapt to it, and lo and behold, you may next say, okay, I'll run a full marathon because I can handle a half marathon quite easily. So the reason I'm giving you these physical examples is because you can quickly see that we do learn to adapt to what are physical stressors. We handle them reasonably well, and then we put our systems into good utilization, and you can become a marathon runner, you can become a mountain climber. Physical stressors are something that our body can be trained to handle and adapts to fairly well. But we also use the very same response circuits to handle psychological and social stressors. So now think about this. Let's say you're waiting for your exam results, okay, which are, I mean, you finish your exam, hopefully you did well, you studied hard, but you have really no control on exactly how many marks you're going to get. The same hormone and neurotransmitter pathways are activated in your body and brain as were activated by running the 5 kilometers or running a half marathon, except that in this case, you have little control of when you will get your results in situations like this, where people are constantly waiting for exams that have been perpetually postponed. Or let's say you start worrying about COVID-19 and say, when will I go back to work? What will happen to my new work environment? Now, these are psychological and social stressors. Presumably, you don't have COVID-19 acutely at the moment, and no one around you has it, but it is occupying a fair bit of your mind and a fair bit of your time worrying about what will be the impact of this pandemic on your job security, on your social milieu, on your ability to execute whatever you want to do effectively. Now, that's a psychological and social stress, one which you have little control over. You don't know when the next vaccine is going to come. You don't know when things will settle. There's a fair bit of uncertainty. And yet the response pathways in your body and your brain are identical to those that happen with an acute physical stress. Why am I using these examples? Because you will see that the system that was really beautifully tuned to allowing you to quickly restore your homeostatic balance under acute and reasonably well under chronic physical stress is perhaps not as well equipped to handle sustained, chronic, unpredictable, and uncontrollable psychological and social stressors. So let's talk about stress response. I just introduced that. So stress response, as I said, is your ability to come back to normal, okay? A homeostatic balance. And more often than not, you will do this beautifully. You will adapt. We are remarkably good at adapting to stress, and we learn to handle stress. So let's give you another example. Most people who come to the city of Mumbai for the first time and travel by local train at peak hours will find it a very stressful experience. It's crowded. It's difficult to manage to get into any cabin. Once you get in, it's almost impossible usually to find a seat. But you will over a period of time start handling this, and then it will become just something that you normally do without even thinking about the fact that, oh, I'm in a very crowded train, sometimes even hanging out near the doorway. And our systems are remarkably attuned to allowing us to adapt. However, these systems can sometimes go awry, go wrong, and then you have disrupted homeostasis. You may even find a new kind of a balance, and that's called an allostatic state, not the normal homeostasis, but an altered state called allostasis. And under those conditions, your body is under something called a sustained allostatic load, which means that you've not been able to go back to normal. You've kind of found some new halfway normal, and that halfway normal is actually putting some degree of load on your body to maintain it. Now, why does this become important? Because this can precipitate and exacerbate several stress related disorders. And this is just a small list. It's almost impossible to find a disorder that is not worsened by stress. Most things are going to get worse if you have an underlying and sustained condition of stress at the same time. Some diseases in particular are precipitated, and actually stress can be a major causative or risk factor. So you can think of stress related psychiatric disorders like depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorder, hypertension, ulcerative colitis, irritable bowel syndrome, immune dysfunction. So there are a variety of diseases that fall into the category of things that are either worsened by stress or are almost precipitated by it in a sense. So now I put up this cartoon, this photograph for you to see, and it's an image of a cheetah chasing a deer. And now you can see that both of these animals are under stress. One is under the stress of needing to escape. So that's the prey. The prey has to get away because it has to live the next day to actually survive. The predator is also under stress because the predator has to catch this animal and hopefully feed itself and its entire tribe or cubs or whatever. So now this is a condition which is acute physical stress. It's short-lived. You rarely see cheetahs going on a marathon run. They go for short, rapid, fast bouts. They go out, and if they're lucky and catch their prey well enough, and if the prey is lucky and escapes, then the cheetah has to go back and do this another day. But this system that we are talking about, the stress response pathway, is beautifully adapted to this kind of acute physical stressor. It is for this kind of systems that the stress response pathways evolved originally. Okay. They're also reasonably good at handling sustained physical stress. So let's give you an example of a physical stress that could arise in this kind of an environment. Let's think of famine, or let's think of the fact that there hasn't been rain for months and you're running out of a good water resource to drink water, which means you'll have to travel further and further away from where you are primarily based to find water. And that is a sustained physical stress for sure. But the system is still reasonably decent at adapting and handling this. It's harmful when it's activated chronically by psychological stressors. One example I gave you was your exam result. How about I give you an even more strange example, one which you have to worry about 3-4 years down the road. Okay, let's say you've invested some money in something and you're hoping that it comes true, that it's going to, eventualize and materialize and you will make a certain amount of money. Now you're watching the stock market every single day. You're worrying about this, but you don't have any real control. You don't know how the stock market is going to fluctuate. No one really does. Even those who tell you that they know how it's going to fluctuate sometimes are guessing at very best. And so you're predicting something which is largely out of your control. But suppose you invested a large amount of money in it, it actually has the ability to give you sleepless nights and completely stress you out. So the reason I put this image up is that there are commonalities between the Serengeti, which is where you see these animals, and Dalal Street. So Dalal Street, just as the NSE index or the Nifty index or whatever index it is goes up and down, so does your blood pressure, so do your hormones that are associated with stress, much the same way as they are doing so in the wild, except in the wild, it's short-lived. You will either become prey or catch your prey. One of the two will happen. But in this case, you have no way of controlling it. It's influenced by many extraneous factors. So the question then becomes, what were we killed by before and what is actually killing us now? So let's look at this a little bit from a stepping away perspective and look at this article from the New England Journal of Medicine. So these are the number of deaths per 100,000 people. And this is largely for the US, but it's broadly applicable to many countries, not necessarily applicable to developing countries. That will change a little bit because infectious diseases are still a major cause of death even in developing countries. But look at what happened in 1900. Major causes of death are pneumonia, tuberculosis, GI infections, diphtheria was still a factor, etc. Now look at what were the rates and the causes of death. One thing that you will obviously also note is that deaths have halved, which means lifespan and sort of the lifespans have really lengthened. Average lifespans in about 200 years ago was 25 to 30 years for in many countries. You lived to be 30, you were old. Whereas today being 90 is considered to be obviously having led a really full life. And that already tells us what biomedicine and biomedical science has done. One of the big things being vaccines. We take it for granted, but pretty much none of us knows anyone who has died of smallpox. And if you move the clock back 100 years, someone or the other in the room would definitely know either a family member or friend who had died of smallpox. That is true for many, many, many diseases. So first of all, we're doing better in terms of survival rates, in terms of lifespan, hopefully also in terms of lifespan quality and life quality indices. But if you look at the reasons that we die now, it's cancer and heart disease. 2020 will throw a little bit of a whack into that number because we have an infectious disease that we currently do not have under control, which is the coronavirus pandemic. I mean, example of that after 1900 would have been 1918 to 1920, when it was Spanish influenza. Every 200 years, 100 years or so, we have these big, unexpected, major pandemics. And they're not really unexpected in that everyone in the biomedical and epidemiology community anticipates them because we're waiting, in a sense, for another major infectious disease to come in at that scale. So this year is unusual. But otherwise, if you look at the major causes of disease, they're more often than not what you call non-communicable lifestyle disorders. Disorders that are slower acting, they tend to kill you over a period of time, and cancer and heart disease become major, major players. Okay, so what are these pathways that I'm telling you about, which are so beautifully designed to help you quickly adapt to acute and chronic stress? So you have, this is the brain, and this is the human brain. And what you can see is that the hypothalamus, which is the structure right at the base of the brain right here, which secretes a variety of factors onto the pituitary, which then secretes a bunch of neuroendocrine hormones into the blood supply, can carry these factors down to the adrenal glands, which are organs that stick on top of your kidneys on either side. So you have two adrenal glands on either side. And these adrenal glands secrete two major factors. One is a steroid-based hormone called cortisol. The other is a molecule that's a neurotransmitter like catecholamine called epinephrine. And they are really responsible for giving you the rapid responses to stress. And this is very easy for me to quickly make you do. I'm going to make you do a little exercise. Measure your pulse rate, okay? Just measure your pulse rate and get a baseline pulse rate for yourself. This will also help me keep my audience engaged with me. I know this is online, very different from the standard forums in which we are used to giving talks. But let's do a little bit of a attempt to actually just measure your own pulse rate. So measure your baseline pulse rate. Take it for about 15 seconds and then multiply it by 4. That will give you a sense of what your baseline pulse rate is. Yeah, so you'll have some sense of a basal pulse rate, somewhere between 60 and 85. Depending on how fit you are, how much you exercise, your resting basal heart rate is going to be different. Okay. Now we're going to do some quick mental math. If two of you are watching this, then one of you give the other person a problem to quickly answer. Otherwise, I'm going to just throw out some sums which you need to solve. Okay. So 24 times 3 48 times 6. Try to solve this quickly. Tight timeline, 24 times 3, 48 times 6. Solve it and then measure your pulse rate within like few seconds of solving. Is anyone ready to give me a response? I'm not the answer, but just how much your pulse rate changed. Anyone see a change in pulse rate? I know everyone's muted, so maybe I'm just going to presume you see a change in pulse rate. Let me go with the presumption, okay? Rapid mental math is a guaranteed way to give you a quick, short pulse of cortisol and epinephrine, which should increase your heart rate by a little bit. Presumably, you're sitting in front of a computer watching this, and yet your heart rate will go up just slightly. And that is just a short, quick, rapid stress response to doing mental math. Now, it depends on how much you dislike mental math or not. The more you dislike it, the more likely you are to have a stress-like response to it. But it's a pretty standard way of getting everybody's epinephrine and cortisol up. It will go up, salivary cortisol goes up, etc. You clearly see a short, quick bout, and it'll go back to baseline because you'll stop calculating very shortly. You'll have solved the problem. They were not that complicated. The more complicated and the more rapidly you have to do this, the more you will have a short stress response. Now let's continue with this idea and then talk about the stress fight and flight response system. So your epinephrine is going to help you.
Vidita,
Vidita,
the thing is, you're not getting responses because most of the people are muted. So when they have anything, they will type it in the chat and they can be unmuted in that case. I will tell you, I have, it was easier for me. I have a Fitbit, so I can directly see my pulse rate. I was 81 before I did the math, I was 86. So I went from 81 to 86.
Okay, great, thanks. So, you will get that little short boost that happens. And that's, of course, some of it is just you doing the mental sort of cogitation, but some of it is just this rapid little stress response that mental math is known to reliably give most people. Now, you want to increase your pulse rate, you want to increase blood flow. Imagine that you were not doing this for a mental math task, but you were out walking in some, forest and you happened to see a tiger. You will want to run away as effectively as you can, or climb a tree or do something like that. And for that, you will have to mobilize blood glucose to your muscles. You will have to stop worrying about digestion, certainly not worry about reproduction. You'll shut down your immune responses from actively being, being mobilized, and you move to an adaptive kind of response at the level of the skin in case you have an injury. There's major changes that take place when you're anticipating something is going to happen. And that's good because that
if I may just say, Vidita, just the stress of public speaking took me to 90. So I was 81, mental arithmetic took me to 86, and public speaking took me to 90.
Absolutely. Public speaking is a very good way of, actually, I should check my own pulse rate. It will be up. So bottom line, you see these really fast fight or flight responses. And the way this happens is the hypothalamus, which is a small structure at the base of your brain right here, secretes a molecule called the corticotropin response factor, which gets then dumped out onto neurons in your pituitary, which then secrete out another hormone called the adrenocorticotrophic hormone. Doesn't matter what these names are, just call them hormone A and hormone B. It's really not relevant to remember that. But ACTH then goes into the blood supply, circulates everywhere, but also makes it to the adrenal gland, which is sitting here, at least in one kidney. You can see it sitting right on top here. And the adrenal gland will now dump out both epinephrine and cortisol. Cortisol if you're human, and even the non-human primates, but corticosterone, for example, if you're a rat. So related molecules, they're derived from cholesterol. They're steroid-based hormones. So now these hormones go all over the body and give you a chance to mount a quick response. They also go to the brain, and there are many places in the brain that are targeted by these hormones. I'm going to tell you a little bit today about one structure in the brain that's particularly sensitive to these hormones. It's a structure called the hippocampus. It's this region right here in the human brain. In the rodent brain, it's this big structure. It looks much bigger, not because it has become bigger in the rodent brain relatively, but because we have relatively had this huge expansion of neocortex, which has not happened in the rodent brain. So relatively, what happens is because we get this big expansion of neocortex, the hippocampus gets pushed downward. And there's a large amount of territory given away to the neocortex. In contrast, in the rodent brain, the neocortical expansion is not as much, and so you see it placed right here. But there is much you can study about the hippocampus in the rodent brain, which is also applicable and relevant to the human brain, and certainly also non-human primates when you study them. So now let's keep going. So here's the structure which is targeted. There's also the amygdala, which is also a major target. For today's talk, I'm going to stick to talking about the hippocampus. Why does the structure become so interesting? It's interesting because here is the presence of receptors for the corticosteroid hormones. These are glucocorticoid receptors. And if you're looking at binding or expression of the mRNA for these receptors, it's expressed very highly in this hippocampus structure bilaterally. So you know that when corticosteroids are secreted in the blood and they eventually make it to the brain, they will be predisposed to binding to this part of the brain very highly because there's a lot of receptor present in this part of the brain. So high hippocampal expression. You also have other factors like norepinephrine and serotonin that get released in these parts of the brain associated with stress. And it's not only is it one of the major targets in the brain for receiving the corticosteroids, it's also the primary site in the brain that inhibits the HPA axis. Now I'm making an acronym. The HPA axis is the hypothalamo-pituitary-adrenal axis, which is responsible for secreting the corticosteroids. So the hippocampus has a very interesting function. It's a top-down regulator of this axis, and what it does is the following. So let's say you're stressed, your HPA axis gets activated, you release glucocorticoids into the bloodstream, they go everywhere, they also go to the hippocampus where they bind to these glucocorticoid receptors. That causes the hippocampus through a multisynaptic pathway to actually shut down the hypothalamus. In a sense, it's that part of your brain that's saying, okay, thank you, wonderful that you switched on the stress response, but I think it's high time that you also switched it off. Switching off the stress response may be almost as important as switching it on, because you want to keep it tight, you want to keep it limited. And these corticosteroids, besides the very many wonderful things that they do, they also don't do very nice things if you keep being bathed with corticosteroids. Okay, this you know, because if somebody asks you to take steroids as a treatment, you will ask the doctor 20 questions. Why should I take steroids? Is it a good idea to take steroids? I'm worried about this. What are the side effects? So much the same way, your own body wants to keep the synthesis and secretion of corticosteroids under very tight control, so you don't keep making them out of control and bathing your entire body and brain with corticosteroids. So this is a nice inhibitory pathway. But then there is a little bit of a trick. So let's say you keep getting stressed. Now you're not stressed in this acute condition of running away from the tiger. Let's say you're worried about, oh, will I still have my job in 2021 end because I've had a rather bad year in 2020? Well, you don't know. You don't know what is going to happen by December 2021. None of us does. So you are now worrying about a situation which is largely out of your control, but it's chronically activating your corticosteroids. If you keep bathing the brain constantly with high levels of corticosteroids, eventually hippocampal neurons start getting damaged. In fact, to the extent that they die. A very elegant work from Robert Sapolsky many, many years ago, in fact, more than 2 decades ago, where he studied baboons in the wild in Uganda. He looked at baboons and their social dominance hierarchy. The ones who were at the bottom of the hierarchy, where there was a lot of infighting and a lot of aggression, those animals also had very high levels of glucocorticoids. And when he looked at the hippocampus after they died a natural death, actually, he found that large number of hippocampal neurons are killed. Okay, so now you have a situation in which you increase glucocorticoid secretion sustainedly, not short term. Short term will not do anything. Sustained, long term, chronic bathing of your hippocampus with glucocorticoids at relatively high levels will really cause damage to those neurons. Then you end up with fewer hippocampal neurons, or you end up with an atrophied hippocampus or a shrunken hippocampus. And when you do that, you now can't switch off the glucocorticoids because the feedback inhibition comes from the hippocampus. So now you have less ability to switch off the glucocorticoid secretion. So you end up with more glucocorticoids, which only end up killing more neurons. And so this is a vicious cycle. Chronic, sustained, uncontrolled stress over which you have no ability to switch it off can really, over a period of time, do a fair bit of damage.
Vidita, there's a question from the audience.
Yeah.
it's a question from Snigdha. If the stress is prolonged, how is the switching off regulated?
So so depending on the nature of the prolonged stress, when it's a chronic stress, it actually switches off fairly quickly. Even though, like an acute stress, let's say it's a single stress, 2 hours. In fact, you actually see the peak within 20 minutes and it comes back to baseline. Even though the stress is going on, you start actually bringing down the corticosteroids quite quickly. Okay. When you see the same stress for 7 days, you may not even elevate the corticosteroids on the second and third day. You may just have a very blunted, short increase because the body is beginning to adapt to that stress fairly rapidly. And the pathways that are telling you that this is stressful are ceasing to view that event as stressful anymore. There's a lot of other adaptation that takes place. Just think about the example of traveling by local trains. The first day, you can't jump into a compartment, you're squashed, you miss the train, you're super stressed out. The second day, it's not so easy, but you manage to get in. The third day, you've made a few friends who help you get in. The fourth day, you have a company of people in the train who, now you make great friends with. They've even kept a seat for you. You sit down next to them. I'm using that as a facetious example, but more often than not, the same stress, after you've handled it, ceases to be very stressful. You start adapting to it. And so your brain will no longer perceive that as a very strong stressor. So you will adapt and you will have a very short but very slight peak, and then it's blunted and actually comes back to baseline very quickly. Yeah. Hopefully that answers that. But that
Also, there's also another question. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, there's also another question from Ramkrishna Podila. He's raised his hand. You are please requested to ask your question.
Yeah. Hey, Vidita. A very nice talk so far. I have a question about the freezing behavior. So usually we respond with fight or flight, but when I was looking at that HPA axis, I'd like to know more about how the freezing behavior occurs.
So the freezing behavior doesn't necessarily recruit the HPA axis. The HPA axis kicks in a little later. The freezing behavior is likely driven completely through the amygdala, talking down to the back of your brain, the brainstem, the periaqueductal gray, and straight down to the spinal cord that results in that kind of rapid freezing. And that is usually because sensory inputs are going directly to the amygdala, not worrying about, the cortex or any such thing. So for example, let's think of a plastic snake that you see. You're not initially going to say, oh, it's a plastic snake. Your first response is going to be, oh, it's a real cobra. Before your, rest of your brain kicks in and says, oh, it's only a plastic snake. You will likely run away or freeze even before you get to the calm down. This is only a plastic snake. I don't need to worry about it. And that's because our systems are beautifully designed to give you that very quick, rapid response. That's likely sensory integration going straight to the amygdala, from the amygdala to the brainstem, down to the spinal cord to evoke quick, immediate response. The second layer of response requires your cortex to integrate the information, say, hey, this doesn't look like a real snake. It's not even moving. In fact, it looks completely and blatantly false. So I better calm down. I don't need to, my heart rate can come back to normal. I don't need to freeze. So that's the second layer of response. And that comes a little bit more delayed. So the fast responses are probably much earlier than even the glucocorticoids have really kicked in. That's at the level of the amygdala, coming in with cortical systems, sensory systems straight out, taking information to the amygdala and out. And those are very conserved pathways because you don't want to make a mistake. In case it was not a plastic snake and was a real cobra, you should have actually responded very quickly.
Right.
So yeah, hope that answers it.
Yeah, and I was wondering, how does this cortisol upregulate neurotransmitters?
Well, it's more likely it's the other way around. Yes, it does. Cortisol can cause an increase in neurotransmitter release. Certainly at the level of the LC, it does. It increases firing of locus coeruleus noradrenergic neurons in the brainstem. So it does. But there's also the reverse, which is serotonin, norepinephrine, etc., will drive the hypothalamus to actually drive secretion of cortisol. The mutual relationship between both those factors.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So now let's come back to this idea of adapt and maladapt, or to adapt or not, which was my alternative title for today's talk. So, I don't want you to walk away with the idea that all stress is necessarily bad, because there is a lot of so-called eustress, or stress which actually is at the milder end, either low in intensity or short-lived, which you adapt to beautifully. And by adapting to it, you actually can show very adaptive changes which will help you to handle the stress the next time. In fact, it may not even be a stress the next time because you handled it so beautifully the very first time. So adaptive changes can include, at least at the level of the hippocampus, enhanced production of newborn neurons, a decrease in anxiety. So mild stress can sometimes actually reduce anxiety. It's almost as though the system is prepping and training itself and handles that quite well. You can improve cognitive function, and all of us know this, especially when we are mildly stressed for an exam. A little bit of stress is perhaps not a bad thing. A little bit of stress before a talk is also a good thing. There's an improved immunological response. All of this is seen at the sort of low, adaptable, handleable stress end. And then there's the other end, which is the maladaptive stress end, which is where you actually reduce the production of newborn neurons. You see pathological anxiety or severe anxiety. You see real impairment of cognitive function and impaired immunological responses. Now, this sort of range of what is low and high varies from individual to individual. Let's think about this one way. So suppose you tell somebody, okay, we are going to have a really nice get together tomorrow and all of us are going bungee jumping. And many people in this audience who are listening will say, wow, how exciting. That sounds like a wonderful idea. I will look forward to the idea of tying a rope around my ankles and jumping off a bridge. And that sounds like my wonderful idea of entertainment. Many of us, me included, will say this is their idea of torture. The idea that somebody can tie a rope around your ankle and you will jump off a building and bounce and bob off a bridge cannot be an idea of entertainment for many of us either. So that's a good example. Both of us will probably have, acute stress response to that event, but some of us will be so traumatized by that for weeks after that, we might have nightmares. The reason I'm using this example is to tell you that what is my stress and what is your stress may not be even across the board. We may respond very, very differently to stresses. What we define as controllable, handleable stress is different from individual to individual. And so our inherent ability to exhibit a resilient response varies from person to person. We adapt differently, it depends on our social networks, on how we handle situations, and it can really vary from person to person. So here's a summary of a variety of changes that happen when you adapt to a stress. Okay, this is a cartoon of the hippocampus that you can see in panel A. You can actually show structural changes within neurons where neurons actually grow new spines. You can actually add newborn neurons within niches like the granule cell layer where you add newborn neurons. You can see a strengthening of LTP via the CRF hormone, which is also secreted in the hippocampus, not only in the hypothalamus. And you can see improved learning and less anxiety. Now, that is known to happen when there is an adaptive response to stress. And this has been shown by a variety of authors and many groups world over as far as the adaptive effects at the level of the hippocampus are concerned. You can also have maladaptive effects where uncontrollable stress in which you have no control, and that's a real critical factor, irreversible or uncontrollable stress where you perceive a lack of control, particularly seems to be quite damaging. And you can have a loss of spines and atrophy. In the very severe cases, you may actually see death of neurons. You can reduce the number of newborn neurons that are added. You can actually see a shift in the sort of synaptic effects where you get leaky conformations of ryanodine receptors, changing calcium dynamics at the spines. You can see behavioral effects where there is cognitive decline, there is a substantial increase in anxiety and despair-like behavior. So you have the spectrum of changes. What about the timing of the stress? Does it matter? Does it matter when you see the stress? And this is where I come to some of the data from my own lab, and I'm very happy to discuss this later. I'm not going to be telling you too much of the data. I'm just going to give you a broad picture of it.
Vidita, before we go into the data, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We have a question which has been there for quite some time. So it's a question from Ushishi Chakraborty. She's saying, she's asking, why do we have anxiety attacks and what goes on in our brain at that point of time?
Okay, so anxiety is normal and anxiety is very natural. Anxiety is actually an essential component. There's a reason why anxiety is hung around through evolution. It's a survival benefit to having some degree of anxiety. So there is what you call trait level anxiety. Trait level anxiety is just your inherent behavioral personality in a sense. How anxious do you get in what are average everyday situations that you face? And then there's pathological anxiety. And pathological anxiety is when you have an inappropriately anxious response to situations that you would largely and should be able to buffer to. In those situations, your body is responding with a full-fledged fight or flight panic response that would normally, which is considered to be inappropriate to the stimulus. I mean, of course, the question is what is inappropriate. But for example, let's say you see a spider and you have arachnophobia, severe phobia, and it causes you a full-fledged panic response. Your heart rate goes up. You feel like your chest is congesting and you almost feel like you're having a heart attack. You can't breathe effectively. Sometimes you feel your throat closing up on you. These are considered to be the hallmark features of a panic attack. Now, that spider is small and it's not going to do anything to it. It's not even like landed on your face. You're seeing it at a distance. And yet it evokes the full-fledged response that would normally be reserved for a situation like a tiger jumping out at you, right? So it's an inappropriate switching on of those systems in a manner that you have no control over. Also an inappropriate switch on which you can't switch off easily. And the kind of drugs that people use to treat that usually belong to the class of benzodiazepines, Valium being the considered classic one of that class, which increase GABAergic activity or GABA mediated neurotransmission, causing inhibition in specific circuits which are being ectopically or strongly activated, the amygdala being one. Also, top-down control of the amygdala is thought to be deficient in anxiety disorders. So the ability to switch off this response requires your medial prefrontal cortex, your insula, your orbitofrontal cortex. And if that switch off does not happen appropriately, then you can have a situation of a runaway fear response, which is not really controlled. So I hope that answers that. Yeah.
We have two more questions, and we actually, if it's okay with you, I'll just ask them.
Sure.
So this one, which is about when you're running for first few seconds. No, I'm combining them a little bit. Okay. So some people are excited by extreme sports and others to high stress. So can one get addicted to these stress hormones? And in continuation, this is a related kind. There is different response to stress by different people, genetically or epigenetically inherited.
Okay, I'll tell you, take the first one, which is, can you get addicted to the stress hormones? No, not really, but you can get addicted to the feeling of the high that you get with the dopamine associated with extreme sports. So absolutely, chronic running, and running will also give you a dopamine related high. No question about it. That's what they call the jogger's high or the runner's high. Endorphins will be released. So it's not the corticosteroids that you're responding to. There are many other factors that are also being released in your brain, some of which are capable of giving you a strong arousal response and a strong reward response. And those factors tend to reinforce the behavior. And so you can absolutely get drawn towards those activities more and more. Yeah, so that's absolutely possible, but it's not to the cortisol. It's to other factors in the brain. Dopamine, the endocannabinoids, etc. Those are the, those are the endorphins, the beta endorphins, etc. Those are the ones that kind of give you that reward hit. The second question is, what programs your inherent underlying ability to respond to stress? Yeah, absolutely. Epigenetic and genetic factors, both at play. I'm coming to exactly that now in this early life stress component. So hopefully I can take that question later in case I haven't answered it with the part that I'm coming to now. Yeah, is that okay, Anushila?
Sure, we'll revisit this later.
Yeah. So one of the fundamental questions about stress and development is, how do you decide to develop your stress reactivity? What determines how stress responsive you will be, or how resilient you will be, or how vulnerable you will be? And one of the key factors in determining that is your early environment. And very seminal studies from Harry Harlow, Seymour Levine, Paul Plotsky, Michael Meany, and others have really set up our understanding of how early environment can really shape the development of your stress response pathways, such that you can have modest or well-controlled stress reactivity, and that reduces your risk for stress-associated diseases. And on the other hand, if you actually don't develop this axis very well, then there's increased risk for type 2 diabetes, heart disease, alcoholism, the battery of affective and psychiatric disorders, aging, etc. Okay. So now let's go to some work from Michael Meany's lab. So let's look at how early life experience can set up lifelong behavioral patterns. So you can set up a lifelong vulnerability to stress based on that early window of experience. And this is work that's come from the Meany lab and others. So on the left-hand side, I have data from the Meany lab. where they were looking at the hippocampus of animals born to low maternal caregivers. And I'll talk about this in a little bit as well, so that will become more clear as I go along. You see enhanced cell death and reduced cell birth in the hippocampus of animals that receive poor or low or reduced maternal care. Much the same way in individuals born and then raised in an environment where there was poor care or there was actually substantial neglect, the activity within the hippocampal and temporal fields is reduced, as is visible in this PET scan in children who had a history of severe neglect. I'll come to this again as we go along. Oops, what is this pink line across my screen? Okay, not clear what that is, but please just ignore it. I don't know where that came from. Are you seeing that, Anushila? These two big pink lines across my screen? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't know what that was. Okay, it's gone. All right. What Michael Meany and his group at McGill have done is across multiple generations, they have looked at a natural pattern of variation in maternal care. So if you look at rodents, and these are Long Evans rats, you can actually profile their behavior and the nature of maternal care they provide. And that's simply you sit and quantitate the amount of licking, grooming, and archback nursing they do. Archback nursing is when they sit on top of the litter and actively lick and groom the litter. Whereas this passive position is when they are not doing active licking and grooming, but they're lying passively on their side and feeding the litter while they're lying on their side. So you can actually count the number of bouts, the nature of care. And of course, there's a nice normal distribution if you look at a very large number of rodents. What Michael Meany and their group have done is they've taken the absolute extremes of this distribution. The ones that do very high maternal care and the ones that do poor or relatively low maternal care. And then they have inbred the two extremes of that natural distribution for multiple generations and then looked at the offspring. And what they noted was that the pups that were born to mothers that did high quality maternal care tend to have low anxiety, and they have a very rapid feedback control of the HPA axis. This is associated with a higher expression of glucocorticoid receptors in their hippocampus, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. In contrast, the pups born to mothers who give low quality maternal care exhibit high anxiety in adulthood on behavioral tasks, and they have a poor feedback control of the hormonal stress response, and they have far fewer glucocorticoid receptors expressed in the hippocampus. And this is work from Michael Meany, Moshe Sif, and others at McGill. So what happens then? What you see is pups born to high maternal caregivers end up with a very effective feedback response. So what happens is when they see stress, they also make CRF, they also secrete ACTH, they secrete glucocorticoids. But because they have many more receptors, their shutoff of this response is more effective and more sustained, and they bring it back to normal very quickly. In contrast, in the low care given pups, these pups also produce glucocorticoids, but their feedback response is relatively poor because they have far fewer glucocorticoid receptors expressed in the hippocampus. And this, by the way, is driven epigenetically, not genetically. It's determined based on the quality of care you get in the first 2-3 weeks of life, where methylation signatures that sit in the promoter region of the glucocorticoid receptor determine the level of glucocorticoid receptor in the hippocampus. Very elegantly shown that it is a non-genomic transmission. It is determined by the care you receive. It also determines the care you will give, because females born to high caregivers tend to be high caregivers. Females born to low caregivers tend to be low caregivers. And if you cross foster, you can erase this, telling us that it's not a genomic transmission, non-genomic epigenetic transmission of this signature.
And Vidita, this is specific to maternal care. This is specific to maternal care, right? Because it's not just a generic signature of chronic stress, right? It's not like if
it's
before this, you had said chronic stress can also cause neuronal atrophy in the hippocampus, right? But this is not generic chronic stress, but specific to maternal care.
Yeah, it's absolutely. It's almost setting up the system that will then later respond to stress. Yeah. So this happens long before stress has even shown up sometimes on the picture. In a sense, it's almost as though the quality of maternal care is setting your baseline developmental reactivity. In this particular model, it happens to be maternal care. In monkeys, in primates, it's much more complex. It's a much more complex society that determines the quality of care in that early window.
But the
yes,
absence of maternal care, is that also a chronic stress in a way?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, yeah, absolutely. And you can't do absence really, because then you will have huge nutritional deprivation. But people have done a variety of models which perturbs maternal care substantially or fragments it. And it mimics this entire model in its entirety. It becomes like the low maternal care in the natural spectrum. In fact, worse than that. So here you see these pups, which are high licking grooming or low licking grooming history. Now these pups are adult, okay? So they've become full-fledged adults. This is their history when they were babies. And the pups that were born to high licking grooming, when they see a stress, so this is pre-stress, this is the corticosteroid levels pre-stress. This is the window in which they get a 20-minute stressor. During this window, you get a nice peak of corticosteroid. What I want you to see is the area underneath the curve. The area underneath the curve is very different based on your inherent stress reactivity, and the amount of corticosterone you will bathe your body and brain with will vary based on your life history and your early life history in particular, because the nature of nurture you got in that early window will determine how you respond here. And that's the point that I was making to Apratim, which is long before the stress, you already may have a predisposition to it, to show a stronger response or to show a more vulnerable response. So yeah, continuing in that idea, this is coming to some of our work. This is looking at the effects of early life stress of maternal separation. We do not use the naturally occurring variation in maternal care. We use a fragmentation model in which we take the pups away from the mother every day for 3 hours, which is actually a very short-lived perturbation. But because this is done in an animal house setting, it causes her behavior to the pup to deteriorate. She does far less licking, grooming, and the nursing bouts stay the similar number, so there's no nutritional deprivation. But the quality of nurture definitely deteriorates. And these pups, we've now observed them across the lifespan and looked at multiple changes that happen in their brain. I will show you some of the changes. We've looked at cognitive behavior, structural plasticity within the hippocampus and the cortex, molecular changes both within the hippocampus and the cortex, and we're very interested in how preventable and reversible these changes are. So we've done some work on that as well. In the interest of time, I'm not going to tell you all that data. I'll just give you the quick summary, and I'll tell you one piece of data because it was interesting. It was very interesting because it tells you that it matters when you look. So when we did this paradigm, this is work done by Deepika and Vandana in the lab. Deepika, a very talented graduate student, and Vandana, a master's student. They worked collectively to do this work. What we did is we decided to look at maternally separated animals across the entire lifespan. Before we did this work, a lot of people had looked, but they'd looked at one time point. And we were curious to see whether whatever is seen across the entire lifespan, whether it's persistent or not. What we found was quite interesting. We looked at their behavior on the Morris Water maze, which is a cognitive task, which is a hippocampal dependent learning task. And we asked if animals have had this history of maternal separation when they were babies, and then we've left them undisturbed, waited for 2 months, waited for them to become adults. Then we've trained them to learn to find a hidden platform in this Morris Water maze. It's a round maze which is filled up with milky water, so the animal cannot see the hidden platform. It uses proximal and distal cues. So it could use like a black and white checkerboard, which is on the side of the tank, or it might use the presence of a red light in the room at a distance. It uses these proximal and distal cues to figure out where the platform is. The first time it just sometimes stumbles upon it, but over a period of time they learn. So you can see on day 1, there are 4 trials every day done with each animal. So each trial is 90 seconds. So they get put in the water, they hunt around, they try to find the platform. Once they find the platform, they get taken out of the task, then they get dried, and then they go through 3-4 such trials every day. And 4 trials every day till they learn how to figure this out very easily. And then they're finding the trial very quickly. Finding the hidden platform very quickly. So what you can see is rather remarkable and very, very unexpected. We did not expect to find this. What we found is that maternally separated animals, that's this group with the triangle, actually do better than the controls. They find the platform a lot faster than the controls, even on the first day. And on day 1, mind you, they have had 4 trials. So obviously the first trial, they're not better because they're as sort of unprepared for this as the controls. But across 4 trials, they outperform the controls. So this is the number of seconds that they take to find the platform. And already on day one, the maternally separated animals with this history are doing better. They do better on day 2 and day 3 as well. By day 4, the controls have caught up. And then after this, it's hit an asymptote and these animals will have learned the task. Then you ask them the next day, okay, now I'm going to take away the platform. I want to see where they look. I want to find out which quadrant. So you can artificially divide your circular tank into 4 quadrants. And you can ask, because we're recording all this with an infrared camera, we can actually watch their movement. We can do all that. You can actually track their movement. Here's the platform on day 2 and day 3. And you can see how the this is an example of a trial from one animal. And then you ask how quickly this animal find it. And on the probe test, you actually say, where is it going to spend its time looking? So you're asking what is the percentage of time it spent in the target quadrant. 25% would be chance, because there are 4 quadrants. And if you spend 25% of your time in that quadrant, you are just taking chance, right? But it's spending close to 60%. So it knows where the platform was when it had been trained. Of course, there's no platform now. It's looking for it in the correct quadrant. And now both controls and early life stress animals do equally well. They remember this even 10 days later. So suppose we come back after 10 days and say, okay, we haven't done anything with you for 10 days. We're putting you back into this paradigm. Do you remember where the platform was? They remember where the platform was. They're way over chance. Okay, they're much, much higher than chance. Then we do this exact same paradigm out at 15 months. Okay, so now these animals, another cohort, not the same cohort, another cohort left utterly undisturbed for 15 months. And now they're middle-aged animals. They're quite big and large, and they've just been living in the animal house. And we train them, and they are no different from controls here. So now you lose that early improvement. The early improvement is gone by the time they're, way many months later. But then something interesting starts happening. They remember the task equally well on the time point at which they were doing it here, which is just one day after the training. But they start to forget. Okay, so they are actually becoming no different from chance very soon after that. So 10 days later, when you look, they're beginning to forget. And this is interesting because when we take a stress neutral task, the Morris water maze is a stressful task. The animal has to swim. It's in this milky tank. It doesn't like being in water. It wants to get out. So there's a big motivational component to that task because the animal actually wants to swim and get out of the water. And there's a stress element to the task as well. Now we're using a stress neutral task. Yeah, someone had a question?
Yeah, sorry. It was a couple of slides back actually that I had the question.
Sure.
I was waiting for you to finish. When you showed the corticosterone levels, so for doing cortisol testing or any sort of in humans at least, that the cortisol levels vary throughout the day. So
of course,
and so the tests are, it's not a single point test. So they take something in the morning and then at 4 p.m. and then a lot of other factors affect it. So how is this plasma corticosterone being measured?
So in this particular case, they will usually be doing this in the morning. The peak for the animals is they're nocturnal. So the peak usually shows up close to 7 p.m. So this is when they are actually not at their peak. And more often than not, these experiments are usually, the way we do them in our lab is also earlier during the day. And then you have the same animal and you're drawing multiple draws of blood from the same animal, which itself, by the way, is a stressor. We realize that. Yes. But you have your controls as well. So you're drawing from your controls at the same time as well. So there is a stress associated with a prick to pull the blood. There's no doubt about it. That will also itself cause a small cortisol peak of its own. But you do it at multiple. So you would take it at pre, which is before you started the stress. Then you take it at 10 minutes after the stress has started, 20 minutes when the stress is getting over. And so you follow up like that.
And also another question I had regarding the pups that you showed later. You mentioned that you take the pups away for 3 hours.
Right.
3 hour separation. So during this time, is there anything else in the cage with the mother, or is it just an empty cage?
She's in a separate cage actually. The pups are also taken into a separate cage. She's taken into a separate cage. They have their bedding, all of that. Then the pups are kept together on a euthermic pad so that their temperature is maintained. Then they get put back into the cage and then the mother comes back. The mother comes back after the pups are returned to her home cage.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a pretty standard paradigm that people have been using from now the 1950s onwards. A very well-studied paradigm.
Okay. No, I was wondering if having, something else, like for example, for kids, you have this heartbeat or whatnot that makes the mother. So So is it, is there any data on such a thing that putting something else,
Well, if you cross foster, I mean, if you cross foster them, you lose all the effects. So you adoption or cross fostering is enough to protect. I'll come to
Okay.
that when I talk about reversibility. Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
absolutely. Yeah, it matters. It matters what you do.
Okay.
Even if you sit with a brush, a wet brush, and sit and stroke these pups, some of these effects are reversible.
Oh,
So
okay.
there's a major sensory stimulation component that's also involved associated with the separation. And that's work coming from Stefania Macari and others, which has shown very elegantly that what you do in that time does matter.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Vedha, there's one more question regarding this topic. Ankush wants to know what would happen if the low maternal care lines go on for multiple generations. Would it make them necessarily depressed from a genetic angle?
No. So people have done 40, 50 generations. I mean, they've gone 50 generations out. Michael Meany's lab has done that. And in one generation, you can reverse it by simply adopting them to high caregivers. So it's not genetic. It's a non-genomic transmission. By the way, remember, this is the same broad line. This was the same. I mean, it's two ends of the spectrum of the same large inbred pool of Long Evans rats. But it is transmitted by the quality of care you receive, which is why adoption can reverse this. I mean, I'm not denying that there's, of course, a genetic component, but at least for these particular behaviors, there's a very strong non-genomic component that depends on the kind of care you receive. And that is that particular generation itself.
Okay, so I think I'll get back to you with the rest of the questions maybe later, because they are not really related to this part as of now.
Okay, so then we did this task with what's called the novel object recognition task, which is both a prefrontal cortex and hippocampus dependent learning task. It's a non-stress associated task. I'll introduce it to you quickly. You can just follow me in the cartoon above here. So we did this in animals that went through a history of maternal separation from P2 to P14 every day, 3 hours away from their mother, then left undisturbed either for 2 months, and another batch left undisturbed for 15 months, and then tested on this paradigm. First, they get acclimatized to this novel chamber. For 3 days, they just go into this new chamber. So the chamber is not stressful to them because they've seen it for 3 days. They got very adapted to going in and coming out. Then on the third day, they get introduced to 2 novel objects. It could be 2 glass cylinders, for example, or 2 big, large balls, for example, whatever, right? So these 2 are 2 novel objects, and the animals like to explore novel things, so they will go and explore these objects and check them out. And then the next day, on day 2, we give them the same object it's seen before and an absolutely new object. And because animals prefer novel objects, and they will remember, or if they have learned and remembered that I've seen this before, they will spend time with this square object. So now we're asking, can you distinguish what you saw before, which is an object recognition memory? You're saying, do you remember this? And do you spend more time with this? And sure enough, our animals do remember, they learn. So this is 2-month-old rats, one which has a normal history and one which had the history of maternal separation. Both do equally well, both remember. And they remember and spend much more time with this, this new object. And then 5 days later, you give 5 days washout and you give the same familiar object and an absolutely new hexagonal object here. I mean, these are just cartoons to describe new objects. And so the same object that it's seen, now it's seen this object on day 1, day 2, again, it's seeing it 7 days later on day 7. So it should remember, I know this object and I've seen it before. And it should spend time with this novel object. And sure enough, at 2 months, all animals know this and they retain this information very well, and object recognition memory is rock solid. So what this tells us that even because of this early life history of stress, while early life stress animals do better, they only do better on those tasks which have a stressor component. Otherwise, they're as good as controls. That itself is interesting because that tells us that perhaps they attend to stressful tasks more and the survival drive is stronger in some of these animals. That's speculating, but it's very interesting and it's something that we see robustly, and we've repeated this multiple times. Now you wait for 15 months and then something really strange starts happening. If you had a history of early life trauma, you can't learn this. You just 24 hours later, when you see this, you are useless at distinguishing. 0 means you can't tell the difference between the objects at all. And whereas the controls, even though they're 15-month-olds, absolutely remember. Now, if you look 7 days later, you do a little bit better because now you've seen the object once, twice, and this is the 3rd time you're seeing it. So even then you're doing a little bit, but your discrimination index is still way lower than the controls. which means that what we are starting to see in animals with a history of early trauma is a hallmark signature of cognitive decline, which is seen with aging. And the aging associated decline is worse in animals that have had a history of trauma. So I'm summarizing all of Deepika and Vandana's work. What they went on to show was that when you look at early stress and you look at the effects of early stress, adaptive and maladaptive may be a matter of timing. It may be when you look. So at postnatal day 21, you see many adaptive changes. There's an increase in newborn neuron formation in the hippocampus. There's an increase in growth factors like BDNF in the hippocampus, and repressive epigenetic marks at the BDNF promoter are removed. Likely why you see an increase in both BDNF mRNA and protein. By the time these animals are adult, the neurogenesis is now back to baseline, but there's still a very robust increase in BDNF mRNA and protein. Repressive modifications are still reduced. Morris-Water maze learning acquisition is improved. There's a substantial change in genome-wide gene expression changes, which I didn't talk about today at all, but there's a major transcriptional change associated with this life history. When you wait for them to become middle-aged, you have the exact opposite. Progenitor proliferation goes down. The number of immature neurons goes down. Hippocampal neurogenesis is profoundly downregulated. BDNF mRNA and protein, which was up early, is now profoundly down when you age. Associated with this, repressive modifications at the promoters of BDNF are robustly upregulated. There's a dysregulated hippocampal transcriptome, indicative of an accelerated aging-like phenotype. There is a decline in Morris-Water maze and NOR performance. But all of this can be rescued if you come in with the right agents that regulate this. One of the things that we found that regulates this are antidepressants, which can actually rescue many of these changes, which was interesting to us. So then the question becomes, okay, if these things are set up so early, are they hardwired? I mean, are you going to, based on your life history, are you pretty much set in place to have either a very enhanced stress vulnerability or great stress resilience? To some extent you are, but what you do after that matters as well. So exposure to early life stress is associated with lifelong deficits in memory function, in stress responses, and can even decrease life expectancy. Even in humans, there's a clear indication that telomere shortening takes place associated with a history of early adversity, but it is reversible. It's not necessarily all bad. There's a substantial role for care. And so when we know individuals have had high early stress, the nature of quality of care that they can get, foster care, by the way, is a profound regulator of these changes. It's been shown both in humans, where a lot of inflammatory and peripheral changes get completely altered based on the quality of nurture and care given. In animal models, stroking and touch is one of the most profound regulators of change in the brain, and in these circuits, enriched environment can profoundly reverse damage done by early life stress. So it is reversible. That becomes very important for us to think about from the clinical implications of this work. And I'm going to wrap up by just telling you that the sort of central questions my lab focuses on are: how does life experience talk to neural circuits to shape emotional behavior? And what are these neural circuits and molecular pathways that underlie both the effects of early life stress as well as antidepressant action? I'll wrap up by acknowledging the collaborators I had on the short study I told you about. I didn't really go into detail, but the work that Deepika and Vandana did was done in collaboration with Sanjeev Galande at IISER Pune, who has helped us extensively with the epigenetic analysis, especially at the whole genome, epigenome level. My funding comes from TIFR DAE. And I'd like to end with this quote from T.S. Eliot from 4 Quartets, where he says, "In my beginning is my end." The reason I like this quote is because that early window is so important in defining what actually happens across the entire lifespan. If one gets it right in that first decade or decade and a half, one is really providing a bank balance for individuals to really go forward and be resilient and manage stress, which is inevitable and cannot be avoided. So I'm done, and I'm very happy to take questions.
I have this question, like you told us, like it's an non-genetic inheritance, right? So does this concept agree with Darwin's use or disuse theory?
I mean, you are probably harking back to Lamarck in this entire idea. I mean, it's almost Lamarckian in that sense, except that in this particular case, it's not really inherited. I mean, it doesn't look like it's epigenetically transmitted necessarily to the next generation. It's a situation in which I would think about it more as quality of care in that first window of life, the first 2 to 3 weeks, is a great determinant of setting your set point. It sort of determines your baseline set point of stress reactivity. And that makes sense because you're using that environment to predict what you're likely to see later. So if you see a highly stressful environment, you want a system that's adapted to very quickly respond and give you strong stress responses. So in a sense, it's I would say that in that sense, if it had been transmitted, one would be looking more at a Lamarckian situation. And that doesn't appear to be the case, at least with these sort of studies. But certainly in terms of environment shaping, it's a question of nurture really shaping how effectively you fine-tune circuits that are set up by a genetic history. So your genetic predeterminants will determine the HPA axis and setting it up. But how you fine-tune it will be utterly determined by environment.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a few other questions as well. There's a question by Yamini Katharia here. Stress also affects healing in the body, and she's saying about how you talked about stress affects inflammation as well. She's talking. She's asking whether there are any healing factors produced in the body just by touch.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, I mean, there's a lot of data on this that came out from neonatal ICUs. NICUs in the past used to not have, they kept the mother away from the neonate because they were so worried about the neonate actually surviving and being able to learn to breathe eventually because it was born premature. But then there was a lot of studies that clearly showed that early touch and early nurture was essential to that development and also to inflammatory responses. And then there was a modification of that policy such that you could actually, encourage individuals to be in the NICU and spend as much time with the infant.
Yeah, I have a question if I can ask.
This is Mandira who's been waiting for some time. I think we could let Mandira go first, and then Ramkrishna, you could ask your question after that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Manashila. Thanks for that wonderful talk. I just had a small question, and that was about how when the pups were given care and not separated from their mothers, I think you had mentioned that it translated into them being better caregivers. Maternally.
That's again
so how
another
does that
paper.
translation?
Yeah. It's actually a beautiful piece of work that again came from Michael Meany's lab. They were looking at the programming of maternal care. So what they looked at was pups born, female pups that were born to high caregivers and low caregivers. And what they noticed was that high caregiver pups that had received high caregiver became high caregiving mothers. And they saw the same thing with the low caregivers. So they began to wonder, is this because of some genomic transmission, which is a possibility because you could be looking at QTLs at the two ends of the spectrum. But what it turned out to be was it could be reversed in a single generation. So how they did this experiment is they took pups that were born to high caregivers and fostered them to low caregivers, took low caregivers and gave them to the high caregivers to look after. And based on the quality of nurture that you have, directly determines epigenetic marks upstream of the oxytocin receptor, defining in many ways the likelihood of the kind of care you will give as a full-fledged adult. So there's an epigenetic transmission of this kind of maternal care as well. If you'd like to read the papers, look up Michael Meany and Moshe Sif. It's a science paper from several years ago, but a very nice study which showed that it's really determined by the quality of care you give. I mean, to the extent that even when you take completely two different strains, so C57 and BL6 and BALC mice are completely different strains. So there will be substantial genetic variation. So when you take two different strains, C57 BL6s tend to be more nurturing and BALC tend to be less. Even when you cross-foster across that, you can see a shift halfway through. It's not a complete, but halfway through. Telling you, of course, there's a genetic component, no question about it, but there's a very strong component of environment, and the quality of care you receive often can have a very strong role in determining the quality of care you give.
I'll definitely look that paper up. Thank you.
So Ramakrishna can go next. After that, we have a few other questions lined up where people have been sending questions in the chat box.
Okay, I have a question that is twofold. The first one is, the great research that you have done. Thank you for sharing it. And the question that I have, first question is that, humans have higher ability, higher capacity for logic, understanding, self-awareness, emotional knowledge. And so how relevant are these animal models in terms of stress handling? Because, I would think that those would come into play. And so can you comment on how relevant these models are to humans, if you don't mind?
Yeah, sure. I mean, these are, the stress response pathways are ridiculously conserved, right? They've been conserved across evolution. So in terms of the understanding of the baseline control of the HPA axis, it's very similar, very conserved across evolution. So they're great in terms of learning the hardwiring of the circuit, how it's modulated, etc. Where perhaps they don't become as good is when you start looking at top-down control of those circuits. In rodents, the medial prefrontal cortex is rudimentary and limited. In non-human primates, it's substantially larger and substantially more complex. So the minute you bring in nuance, context, the ability to remember things, the ability to say, okay, I'm going to actively use my cognitive capacities, my own ability to shut down the stress response, that becomes relatively harder to extrapolate from rodents to humans. It's a better extrapolation from non-human primates to us because the expansion of the cortex has been substantial. There's a reason why cognitive behavior therapy works as effectively as it does, which is that we do absolutely have the ability to use cognitive capacity to control and modulate our stress responses. However, in the basics and the nuts and bolts, the amygdala responses, the subcortical responses, the responses at the level of the HPA axis, very conserved and very well, a very good system in which it is amenable to addressing these sorts of questions, right? So I would say that you have to be careful before you fully extrapolate. We are dealing with a far more complex system in humans with way more ability to provide context and to provide a cognitive understanding of issues, but also that there is much we can learn from other animal models as well. And one is as long as one is careful about extrapolation. So for example, maternal separation would be a poor thing to extrapolate. Clearly, the minute you even move to a monkey, maternal separation doesn't work. When you try maternal separation in a monkey, it will not have those kind of effects because there is peers. There are so many other individuals that are involved in nurture in a monkey that just taking away the mother doesn't have any effect. You actually have to do something called peer isolation in monkeys to start seeing similar effects that you see in the rodents, which tells us that even in other rodents that have biparental systems where the mother and the father. So in biparental systems, there is a paternal contribution and a big effect of paternal deprivation as well. So I think as long as you're careful in what you extrapolate and don't immediately do a jump from what you see in a model, because in what you can do in a mouse model or a rat model may not be applicable even to another rat model. You have to be careful because maternal separation will not be effective in models which have biparental care, where the father is doing equal amount of care. Minute you move to a monkey, it's not even enough to take away those two primary caregivers. There are lots of other individuals involved. There are many other matriarchal figures. There are other patriarchal figures that are involved in care. And so you need peer isolation. And the minute you move to human, you will have so many individuals that are involved in care. Care is not done just by the mother and the father. I mean, there are all those other individuals that are involved in care as well. Much more complex. So yeah, I think as long as one is careful and one takes the nuts and bolts, but doesn't quickly just extrapolate everything else, one can absolutely learn a lot from these systems.
And the follow-up question to that is, I'm really concerned about the way psychiatric care is being given to humans, and especially for things like anxiety disorders or stress that is associated with mental illnesses. There is absolutely no testing of any biomarkers of any sort. It's right now mostly based on a multiple choice questionnaire of some sort that the patient who is under stress has to answer, or who is, you're essentially, for example, if you have a bipolar disorder person, you're asking the person, are you depressed? So my question, what I'm trying to get at is, we have these sensors that we make for, say, sensing dopamine or cortisol or any neurotransmitters, but we can only sense what is in plasma. How do these things that are in plasma, that you're measuring in plasma, correlate to intracranial levels?
So there's a reason why psychiatrists can't check for biomarkers, because there isn't a good test for any of the psychiatric disorders as far as a blood test or a biomarker test at the moment. Even if you were to look at cortisol and you were to do what's called the dexamethasone suppression test, only 50% of individuals who have depression show a dexamethasone suppression test positive, in that they fail to suppress after being given external dexamethasone. So that just tells you that we are looking at very heterogeneous syndromal illnesses that are complex and cannot be as easily defined with one or two simple biomarkers, and certainly poorly at the level of the plasma. I would say this is where a lot of subjectivity, of course, comes into it, because it's dependent on the psychiatrist using their own internal expertise. And hopefully you have a good psychiatrist available to an individual. They should be able to detect using even a questionnaire-based method, because severe depression or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia are identifiable, and one can figure them out based on just interaction, not just with the individual, but also carefully with individuals who are around that individual. Unfortunately, there just aren't very good effective biomarkers one can look at. Also, it's difficult to extrapolate from plasma levels of BDNF or cortisol instantaneously to what's happening at the level of the nervous system. It's not very often a robust indicator of what's actually happening within the brain. This makes it very complex to determine first line of treatment. Also, because there's a lot of treatment refractory patients for depression, 30% of patients don't respond to any antidepressants that's out there. So 2/3 respond, 1/3 will not respond. And that itself tells you that we are dealing with very syndromal illnesses that are complex and difficult to treat, but they do respond in many cases to a combination of medication and cognitive behavior therapy. And the combination of the two can have a profound effect as well. So yeah, I mean, it's not the dark ages of psychiatry anymore. The dark ages were about 50 years or 60 years back, but and it has improved significantly compared to that. There are many new treatments out there, but it's still ways away from us having a deep understanding of what's actually happening within the brain in these disorders. So there's a reason we don't have it. We just don't know enough in many cases.
Okay, so Vidita, there are some other questions here. So, is it always necessary for a phobia to arise from an early traumatic experience? For example, fear of sleep, fear of technology, etc. How can one connect such phobias to early life traumatic experience?
No, it's not a given that early life event is a driver of a phobia. Not at all. It may be. Certainly, early adversity, early stress has been linked to some of the anxiety disorders or to general anxiety, GAD, which is general anxiety disorder. But it's not a given at all. Not at all. So one should not walk away from that. And more often than not, sometimes from what people say, at least psychiatrists who have expertise in this say, maybe you don't necessarily want to go digging for the cause of the phobia. What you want to do is actually habituate and reduce the phobia. And there are a lot of people who actually provide that kind of training that allows people to get rid of those phobias. And they do it under controlled conditions, sometimes under the treatment of medication, and they get rid of it. And people do have recovered from phobias. So it is possible.
Okay, so there are more questions here. Is there a threshold time period for the mouse to be nurtured for better cognitive development?
A great question. What's the critical period? I mean, that's a very fundamental question. And we know that the first 2 weeks is absolutely essential for the stress responsive pathway. So we know this from work again from Paul Plotsky. Plotsky did the maternal separation paradigm in the 3rd week. So you don't do any separation in the first 2 weeks. So usually the pup is with the mother for the first 3.5 weeks or so, before which they then start becoming fairly independent and they are adolescents and then they are on their own. But if you take that first 3-week window, the first 2 weeks is when maternal separation works. If you do maternal separation in the 3rd week, it makes no difference, which means by then these systems are already set. And even if you separate, it really makes no difference. So there is a critical period window in which the separation has to be done. And that is a fundamental question. People still don't understand what determines the boundary conditions for that critical period window. They have some ideas of what's going on in the brain in that window, but they don't really know how hard and fast that end stop is. Much the same way in humans, that debated critical period window for stress pathways is perhaps the first 10 to 12 years. So that's that first decade. It's longer, certainly in humans and non-human primates than obviously in rodents. But we don't have a complete handle on what determines the on-off for those critical periods. it's beginning to be understood beautifully for sensory systems, and perhaps those insights will apply also to systems like this.
Okay, so
Another question.
Okay, go on.
Okay, all right, please go ahead.
Okay, so in this case, would that be because of plasticity, as in the brain is still adapting to whatever the environment it's getting right now, and in the very early stages, still, as you said, 12 years or something. So
I mean, that could be, but if that's the case, then there's a fair bit of plasticity going on all the way up to the juvenile window. So, you know, I mean, certainly in the third week of life, it's not nowhere near closed by 2 weeks. You know, it goes on all the way up to the juvenile windows. So, it's probably going to be something about the hypothalamo-pituitary axis, which is unique to the first 2 weeks. There's something called the stress hyporesponsive period that comes to an end around the second week of life. It might be that that system is beginning to sort of shut down its plasticity to a certain degree. That's why it's the first 2 weeks for rodents. But there's been a heavy debate on this. I mean, there are perineuronal nets that also signal the closure of critical period plasticity. There's other indicators, GABA switching from excitation to inhibition in that window, a variety of other things that happen that indicate a closure of critical period. But I mean, while we have lots of available mechanisms, we don't have a nailed down mechanism at the moment. It's not that it isn't understood. It's just that there are many available theories right now, and no one clear cut one which you can say absolutely this is why it happens. That isn't available.
Thanks.
All right. So there's another question about, can someone's stress tolerance be genetically inherited, or is it only based on someone's life experience?
No, absolutely, it can be genetically inherited. There's no question about it. So I mean, you know, I've gone so much in the direction of nurture. I might not have spent enough time focusing on the fact that, of course, there's a genetic component, no question about it. I just don't want you to leave with the view that it's one versus the other or one over the other. It's really an amalgamation of both. So this whole nature versus nurture debate that lasted for a long time is dead in the water. It's obviously a contribution of both. So there will be a genetic component, no question about it. But then that genetic component will interact with the environment to eventually determine the unique level at which an individual's stress reactivity finally comes to rest.
Does the gut microbiota derived metabolites modulate stress by regulating the glucocorticoid level in the blood?
Great question. I don't know about glucocorticoid levels in the blood and whether they are influenced by the gut microbiota. There might be something on this. I might have missed it. But the gut microbiota dramatically changed the amount of serotonin that is released in the periphery. And that's directly determined by the gut microbiome. And the other big driver of determining cortisol responsivity and determining the enteric nervous system and the autonomic nervous system programming is serotonin in the periphery. And that is absolutely sensitive to your gut microbiome. I would be surprised if there isn't at least an influence on cortisol via serotonin through the gut microbiome. I can't think immediately of a direct example of gut microbiome and direct corticosterone responsivity. There might be something, I might have missed it, but there was very recent evidence that strongly indicates gut microbiome directly influencing serotonin. Serotonin, we know 100% influences the HPM. So indirectly, absolutely.
There's another question from the audience. Can we call cognitive control as a protective aid against stress, as we usually see people attain, that is, to be able to control their response while through yoga or meditation?
Absolutely. I mean, you totally can. The ability to switch off subcortical circuits, which is your hypothalamus, your amygdala, other circuits like that, top-down control from cognitively controlled circuits. So your medial prefrontal cortex, your insula, your anterior cingulate cortex, your orbitofrontal cortex. These are your integration cortices. These are all the cortices that have expanded in evolution dramatically. And those cortices are in complete top-down control of many of these circuits. So there is no question about it that you can train those circuits to do better and more effectively. You can absolutely watch your own stress response and dramatically influence it by breathing is one great example. Breath control. There's a reason why they do lamas with women who are delivering. I mean, it helps with pain control. It also helps directly with stress response. So absolutely, there's no question that there will be an impact of top-down circuit level control of these pathways. And that's the big dramatic difference in evolution. We've been endowed with a much larger neocortex that allows for top-down control of subcortical circuits. So no question about it.
Do we have any other questions for now? Okay, so as of now, we have no other questions. If we, I think we have received some on our social media inboxes, which we'll send across to you, and you can maybe answer those questions later.
Sure.
So thank you so much, Vidita, for this extremely interesting discussion on the early stress of maternal separation. And when we first thought of taking Sawal Jawab online, we knew that there would be some restrictions because it's not going to be a face-to-face interaction. But I think the way you steered this discussion so beautifully, this has sort of, put all those fears to rest. Like this has been a wonderfully interactive session, and we are so thankful that you took time out for this as well. So thank you so much.
Bye, my pleasure.
Bye. Thank you. And thank you everyone for attending this session. We hope to see you next month with another such interesting session again. So thank you everyone. Thank you, Vidita.
Bye.
Bye.